Hi, everyone, and welcome to ME24, the Middle East Breakdown, our weekly podcast where we sit with top experts from around the region to break down and contextualize current events, complex events, interesting events taking place all over the Middle East. I'm Dan Feferman, co-founder, co-editor of ME24. Usually is with me is my co-founder and co-editor, Havi Buzo. Today, she is off on a speaking tour, and I am super excited to be joined by Ahmed Quraishi, who is joining us from Islamabad today. Hi, Ahmed.
Yeah, good to join you. I'm bummed that Havi's not with us, but you're good enough.
But she will be, and I think you'll fill the shoes very nicely. Before we get started, and before I introduce Ahmed, I'll just say Middle East 24, of course, is your go-to source for fast and accurate information, analysis, and content on the Middle East. And our agenda is simply to cut through the propaganda and the lack of understanding and media bias so that you get the real story of what's happening here in the broader Middle East, North Africa region. Launched recently in partnership with Visegrad 24. Make sure you're following us on X, on Instagram, now on YouTube. Make sure to download, to subscribe to this podcast, ME24 Breakdown, wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, and please give us a good 5-star rating. It certainly helps us out. So today we are super excited to have with us veteran Middle East analyst, advisor, war correspondent, and a good friend of mine, Ahmed Quraishi, who is joining us live from Islamabad. How are you, Ahmed?
Great to see you. I'm very well. Thank you.
History has been made this week. The 2-year war between Israel and Hamas that has captured global attention, the war that was sparked 2 years ago by Hamas's brutal invasion of Israel, has come to an end under, I can't describe it as anything other than, of course, the pageantry of a Donald Trump-led peace summit in Egypt. What have been your thoughts this week as you've watched events unfold?
Dan, you're going to get me emotional, man, because I thought back in 1995 when I saw Arafat and the great Eshat Rabin shake hands after the Oslo Accords, honestly, because I was a kid. I was a toddler when Anwar Sadat made history, travel all the way to Jerusalem and address the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. So for me to be aware and watch Ishaq Rabin and Arafat shake hands was like, I thought this is the end of history for me. I've seen it all because I've been reading about, from starting from 20th century or end of the 18th, 19th century. For me, that was like it. And now for us, Dan, to see this week what happened in Sharm el-Sheikh, I never thought I'd see the 8 largest Arab Muslim nations come together to support America and Israel on a plan in Gaza. I think we've seen it all. Come on, let's wrap it up. Let's end history. Let's end everything, we've accomplished.
You're sounding a little you're sounding a little Fukuyama-ish in your
analysis. I know, yeah. Yeah, because I'm really trying to control myself. I'm not an emotional person. I'm a very realist, very much. But this is really one of those things that you never think you'll see. I thought Abraham Accords in 2020 was the it moment. And here we are just 5 years down the road, and we have Sharm el-Sheikh. My God. And I'm from Pakistan. Been through Afghan jihad and Al-Qaeda and bombings and God knows what else. And to see my country's prime minister stand in Sharm el-Sheikh, where, by the way, he could have been sharing stage with the Israeli prime minister had he joined. He didn't at the last moment. But to stand there, my country's prime minister also, and then to stand there and deliver that tribute to President Trump. So a lot of surreal thing, and to see the president of Indonesia, of all countries, not Egypt,
the largest Muslim country in the world,
the largest, to see their president first 2 weeks ago stand in New York and tell the world, people, listen to me. If you want peace in the Middle East, guarantee the security of Israel. Can you think of a more less politically correct thing to say at this time, to say, guys, I'm telling you to stand by Israel, Do you know the number of boos you're going to get, for saying that? He said, and he's the leader of the largest Muslim nation, and he's advising other Muslim leaders of the same idea. And for him to come to Sharm el Sheikh and say, you know what, I'm going to put on the ground 20,000 Indonesian soldiers in Gaza, many of them are Muslims, many of them, who will fight, by the way, the Palestinians, possibly, of course. I'm just, I'm just analyzing here. He didn't say that. He didn't say that, but I'm analyzing who might end up fighting Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas elements inside Gaza. So can you think of anything else, Dan, that is more out of this world? Anything? I mean, what we saw this week is the antithesis of everything that I grew up reading and expecting to happen, even around the turn of the. Thank you for referencing Fukuyama and the clash of civilizations. And just 25 years ago, we were thinking, everybody believed that we will actually have new wars and clash of civilization, and we kind of do have clash of civilization.
That was Huntington, by the way. Fukuyama
Sorry. Thank you for the correction.
the end of history. That's why you triggered my associated memory in there. It's interesting to hear you that excited, and I want to come back to the Pakistani prime minister there. And from what I read, I want to come back to this towards the end of this conversation, because from what I'm reading, this international force that's going to come in is going to include Indonesians and Pakistanis, and it's very interesting to think of the prospect that these two countries that have never really had a horse in this race, other than kind of saying the towing the pro-Palestinian line internationally, might be sending peacekeeping troops or demilitarization troops or de-radicalization troops to Gaza. I mean, that's fascinating. I want to come back to that at the end. But let's step kind of from your regional view, your regional experience, your years covering and living in the Middle East. The last 2 years, we've experienced, in some ways, a very new kind of war here, right? And unlike the previous 7 rounds of conflict between Israel and Hamas, Israel and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the October 7th attack, I try to explain this to people, and this was part of Hamas's plan. The October 7th attack was so absolutely brutal that Israel had no choice but to finally go in and do what it didn't want to do the last 19 years, and that is take out Hamas. How have you viewed kind of these last 2 years of this war, as far as its broader impact on the region, maybe as far as the struggle between jihadists and state actors? What have been kind of your thoughts as you observed the last 2 years of this conflict?
So I have a problem with the Jews. And who doesn't? Get in line. And so there's a whole list, long list. So I have a problem.
Are you familiar with my definition of anti-Semitism?
No, go ahead.
I wish I could take credit for this. I don't know who coined this, but I'm borrowing this. Anti-Semitism is defined as disliking Jews more than is necessary.
Wow. Wow. I love
We say that
disliking Jews more than is necessary. I love it.
it's a joke because everyone seems to hate us, and so we take.
Did you coin this?
I
Can I?
didn't.
Okay, but I'm going to reference you because I heard it from you. I didn't read this anywhere else. So I have a problem with the Jews. The Jews can be sometimes good to a fault. And one great example of that is after October 7, the Jews of Israel refused to release some of the most vile, depraved videos and images of what terrorists from Gaza did inside Israel. So I'm so sorry that you guys did not release those videos. Even now, you refuse to do that. And when I ask somebody, excuse me, you won't release? How do you expect the world to know how bad this attack was? And the answer I hear from Israeli Jews is, well, you know what, Ahmed, we have, in Torah, in Judaism, we need to respect our dead. And I was like, are you Are you serious? Do you know the kind of the war of ideas around this war? You need to release this, and but nobody released it. I mean, just recently, the state of Israel, the government did release partially some of the images, but they're still not elect. So go exactly. So going back to my point, sometimes the Jews are good to a fault, and unfortunately, Israel and the Jews lost the media narrative from day one, because the moment Israel rightfully retaliated, which is what any country would have done. We in Pakistan were attacked by Al Qaeda after 9/11. We went ruthlessly after them. We arrested them. We stripped them. We made them stand in groups without clothes to check if they have if they have bombs or something. Yeah, and we moved hundreds of thousands of people, entire towns and villages from one place to another so that we wage war. We were attacked from across the border inside Afghanistan. We were attacked from across the border inside Iran. We went inside and we attacked. Unfortunately, there might have been collateral damage. Innocent people being killed. That's war, unfortunately. But we had no option. So Israel did what any country would have done, and that is to go and fight back and neutralize the threat, which affected its citizens. So
That
yeah,
was that understood? Was that understood? Because if you were to watch, Western media, sometimes it was understood, sometimes it wasn't. Middle Eastern media, if you follow Al Jazeera, if you follow a lot of the Middle Eastern media that I do follow, and I'm sure you do as well, it was
I started working with Al Jazeera when it first came out in late 1990s, early 2000s, and very briefly. In fact, some of the well-known Israeli-Palestinian journalists who are known to be, Palestinian journalists, faces of Al Jazeera inside Israel and Palestinian territories. We shared some workshops in Doha, Qatar, in those early years, including, for example, Shireen Abu Akleh and maybe a couple of others as well. So I worked in Al Jazeera as well. What I'm going to say is here, Dan, is if you remember what Trump said, Israel has a public relations problem. I think it does, and I don't blame the Israelis. You have a small country or a small people, like what 9, 10 million people, and you're fighting like on 7, 8, 9, 10 fronts. If you include the social media warfare and online warfare, it's like, I don't know, 12 or 13 or 15 fronts. And you can't expect a country or state to fight online, on the ground, on multiple fronts at the same time. But you do have a public relations problem. And one of the biggest problems you faced after October 7 was how to stop the vested interests from hijacking what happened on October 7 and turning it into about Palestinian aspirations. This is not about Palestinian aspirations. This is about a terror organization that hijacked 2 million Gazans and used them as human shields in order to serve the interest of the axis of evil of Iran, Hezbollah, and all the other proxies across the region. The 2 million Palestinians were net losers alongside the people of Israel. To me, both were victims, minus, of course, those in Gaza who were part of the attack, of course. So unfortunately, this clarity, this narrative was lost then. And all of a sudden, from the very first week after October 7th, by October 14th, the only narrative I was seeing in the international media was Palestinian state, Palestinian suppression, Palestinian struggle. Yes, I respect Palestinian aspirations, but this is not about Palestinian aspirations. This is not about Palestinian state. This is not about Palestinian politics. This is about a terror organization which is run by Palestinians in Gaza, but they allowed themselves and their people and their territory, the enclave, and the freedom that they had for 2 decades, for 20 years, that Israel actually, when the IDF vacated and handed over the territory to them to turn into an example of a Palestinian state, or the early stages of the Palestinian state, they used it to to become pawns in Iran's wider game. Iran is a country. I don't blame them. They have their own interest. not the people, definitely, but the I
Exactly.
always distinguish between. I don't even use the word regime, Dan. I distinguish between the good Iranian people, the majority of them, and the Khomeiniist political. It's a political party. It's called the Khomeiniist, although they do not describe themselves as such
Right.
because they don't want to distinguish between themselves and the Iranian people and the state. But there's a distinction, and it's a Khomeiniist political group that is running. And unfortunately, these Palestinians, the small group of Palestinians at Hamas, hijacked Gaza, hijacked 2 million Palestinians, and put them in the hands as pawns in the hands of the Khomeinis who rule Iran to serve their interests. That was the story. But unfortunately, Israel was too busy to remind everybody, hello, excuse me, this is not about Palestinian aspirations. This is about this. And it's about freeing Gaza from that terror organization. That narrative was lost. The
They
good
came
part is,
they came out hard and fast with the starvation,
yeah,
with the
yeah,
genocide, with the ethnic cleansing. And the one critique, you're right, Israel has a bad PR problem. Part of the problem is the government here is never minded to it. They fired the quite talented spokesperson, who invented the job. There was not a government spokesperson. Someone took it on themselves, Elon Levy, to do it voluntarily. Then he became official. Then they fired him after he was getting too much attention.
yeah,
But part of it is you also had right wing ministers, far right wing ministers, who were using the terminology and calling for ethnic cleansing, genocide, etc., starvation.
exactly.
Except that wasn't the policy, and so if you look at the
So
ICJ.
you were basically asking, Dan, you were basically asking the world in the middle of a war to try to understand Israeli political complexities, internal. That was impossible to do. For
It is
most
impossible.
people world.
And my big critique of the Israeli government, lots of critiques before the war, but during the war, they fought a very complicated war, as you said. On we like to say 7 fronts plus the PR front, so it was really 8 fronts, and you have to get everybody in the government and the Knesset, public officials need to shut up, and there needs to be a very clear line of communication. Netanyahu himself or the Minister of Defense should have been briefing the press every single day, and it wasn't happening. And so you took a situation in which the Israelis are already very bad at it, and you made it worse by not even playing the game that needed to be played. But I have a question for you. Post Abraham Accords, right? We had 5 years, or really 3 years, 3 years of Abraham Accords. We had a lot of progress. We were on the cusp of an Israeli-Saudi agreement. And I always say in all of my lectures, if the original Abraham Accords were the beginning of winding down, of ending the Israeli-Arab conflict, a peace agreement with Saudi Arabia will fully end the Arab-Israeli conflict. It has to, because the Saudis can't accept anything less as the leader of the Arab and the Muslim world. And I think Hamas knew that, the Iranians knew that, and so they launched this attack in large part to torpedo it, but of course as part of their messianic vision to collapse, to finally bring about the end of Israel. And as one of my friends, he's a brilliant analyst of Islamism, um, Khalid Verdman, in Germany, says, they have to prove their cause. They have to prove the just, righteous, divine nature of their cause as Islamists by defeating Israel, by defeating the Zionists. And and so they had to torpedo the Abraham Accords, the Abraham Accords 2.0. Did anything change in the Arab world's coverage of this conflict since it took place after the Abraham Accords?
Yes, very much it did, and I'm glad you asked this question, Dan, because come to think of it, now that you're asking this question, I'm surprised nobody actually discussed this aspect. And yes, we saw a difference thanks to Abraham Accords. I was astonished to see and I call them brave voices in Arab media. There were Lebanese, there were Syrians, there were some Iraqis, mostly, and quite substantial, by the way, you'll be surprised, also Egyptian, but the largest were in the Gulf, who actually said, wait a second, this is not Palestinians attacking or fighting Israel as a liberation movement, October 7. This is extremists working for the Iranian Khomeiniist agenda, trying to scuttle peace between Arabs and Israel and between Palestinians and Israel that Saudi Arabia was working on. So yes, thanks to Abraham Accords, in the throughout these 2 years after October 7, I think there were very brave commentators and journalists in Egypt, mostly in Egypt and in the Gulf, but mostly in the Gulf, but also others in Lebanon and elsewhere, who actually, yes, to answer your question, thanks to Abraham Accords, had the courage to say, no, we will not be dragged into a lynch party against Israel and the Jews. We will, yes, there are certain things maybe Israel is doing wrong. We will critique that. But this is not about standing shoulder to shoulder with Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran against Israel. If we have to choose, we actually maybe can work with Israel better than we can work with Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran. So
That's
that's
massive, Ahmed. That's massive.
that's
So
massive.
that's a big
That's
thing.
huge. Yeah, yeah.
And it was
I mean,
not it was not noticed in the Western media. This nuance that you're talking about, because if you go to Western media, and of course you still have the radical voices, and of course Al Jazeera is the most prominent. Well, it was basically a Hamas stage. It was a Hamas platform for their spokespeople, and then they would find the occasional, anti-Israel Jew, who they keep throwing on the air, or these professors from the far left in America. Um, but what you're describing here is a drastic change in the Arab world discourse that I believe went completely under the radar in Western media, because the Western media does not understand the Middle East.
it was the first Palestinian war against Israel in which most of the Arab world did not support the Palestinians. Of course, there are nuances. When I say this was the first Palestinian war against, it was not probably a Palestinian war. It was Hamas, but there were Palestinians, and they launched a war against Israel, and they claimed they're doing it because they represent Palestinian struggle. Although I believe they did not. But this was the first time that a group of Palestinians, to be more accurate, attacked Israel, and most of the Arab world did not support them. Can I repeat this, please? This is big. This huge. This is the first time that the Arab world is not supporting a group of Palestinians attacking Israel. Hello, this is huge. And I'm sorry that in the West, most of the people in the West, people in governments in the West, missed this huge shift in the Arab world. And the only reason, and Dan, you just put your finger on the thing that really explains it. This change happened thanks to Abraham Accords. People in this part of the world, on my side, the Arabs, the Muslims, were willing to say, wait a second, we're not going to go after Annie, Tom, Dick, and Harry standing up and saying, we're attacking Israel, we're killing 1,200 Jews, and we're doing it because we represent Palestinian struggle. No, you do not. You're fooling us. You're working for Iran. Wait a second. You're trying to scuttle the peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which would have helped the Palestinians. So this happened thanks to Abraham Accords.
So thanks to Abraham Accords, I've said this many times. I think you'll agree with me here. The Abraham Accords came about under President Trump, and of course, a hugely divisive world leader, certainly divisive in America, to the point where I can tell you I've given probably hundreds of lectures across the United States over the last few years about the Abraham Accords and foreign policy. And anytime I'm in a setting that it leans more blue as opposed to red, uh, people have oftentimes not even heard of the Abraham Accords, only because they associate it with Trump, and they don't want to even conceptualize that someone in their point of view is such a vile figure could have done anything good or real or rational. And I believe they're missing. When I, as an Israeli, talk about Trump, I am not talking about any of his domestic agendas or his personality. I'm talking only about foreign policy, and only specifically, I talk about Middle East foreign policy. And once again, you had to have you have all these presidents throughout American history, since really the 1960s, the 70s, certainly, every American president thinks they're going to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict. And what drives me nuts, we talked about this in the other conversation we had that's aired separately, and we encourage our listeners and our viewers to check it out. Um, uh, the very fact that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is called the Middle East conflict, as if there aren't, conflicts and civil wars and cross-border conflicts taking place literally from Morocco to
Yeah.
Pakistan and everything in
We
between.
all.
90% of them have nothing to do with Israel, but Israel somehow is the Middle East conflict. And it's this, finally you had a president, for good or for worse, who w- broke all norms. Maybe because they didn't read the history books, and maybe because they didn't hire all of, the Washington elites, Democrats and Republicans, who thought they knew everything about the Middle East. And he brought some real estate lawyers, and the real estate lawyers just came in and looked at things with the fresh eyes and said, "Why can't we solve this?" And that's what they did. So the Abraham Accords was the first time that you had a U.S. president, a world leader, say, "Why do we have to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict first? And then the rest of the region. Why can't we start with the rest of the region, and then it will help solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?" Jump 2 years into this horrendous war. This was a very complex war, partly because of the way the Palestinians, specifically Hamas here, I have to say, and their backers in Qatar, and their backers in Turkey, and their backers in Iran framed it. Partly because Israeli leaders refused to make bold moves diplomatically, partly because of these right-wing ministers and political, influencers who talked in terms of genocide and ethnic cleansing and a refusal to recognize ever any kind of Palestinian state or entity. Um, Give me your insights here into why Trump was able to come in, Trump and the second administration, the White House, and bring about this plan that finally seemed to have figured out the Rubik's cube of the Israel Hamas conflict.
You framed it. So this is how I see it. Trump basically did one more thing. I mean, you described it so well, Dan, when you said he skipped all the I would say Mideast establishment in Washington D.C. and went for these real estate lawyers, and they did wonders. Jared Kushner, Witkoff, others back in 2020. But here's one more thing, Dan, that Trump did. Trump actually essentially showed everyone that this is not as complex a conflict as all of you think. It's not as it's not about old colonialism and God knows what else and struggle. No, it's a very simple thing. It's two peoples who always lived in that territory. It's basically a Jewish, history in that land, but they're also Arabs, the Christians. And there was a solution back in 1948. One party didn't accept it and went for a civil war and lost, and rejected every solution. And now the solution for it is coexistence and to shun violence. He showed that this is really a simple conflict that can be easily resolved if you have the intention to resolve it. But here's the thing, Dan, also about Trump is that, the way Trump did it, um, I just, I often find myself at a loss for words because what can a person like me say who was indoctrinated since age 7 in the ABCs of conflict that is now being resolved in a way that bears no resemblance to anything that I was taught and saw in our media and continue to see on channels like Al Jazeera, for example, and hear from some intellectuals and academia types in the West, in London and Amsterdam and New York, who continue to tell me, I, a native to the Middle East, keep telling me, Ahmed, no, 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 please understand, this is a far more complex. The Palestinian Israeli complex is part of a global fight between, I don't know, global south and north and God knows what else, the whole jargon. And I was like, excuse me, do not try to hijack the the plight and the situation of the peoples in my region. I recognize the Jews as being intrinsic and domestic and internal and natives to the Middle East. And they can coexist and share land with us here. And we must and we should if we want to have peace. We don't want to be dragged into your crazy theories about global north and south and God knows what else, and colonialism and decolonization and all the jargonry of the global left, that we've grown up, hearing. So we want none of that. What Trump did, Dan, is to sort of separate us from all of that jargon and simplify the conflict and show the Arabs that you can look at the Israelis as partners for the first time. Because remember, Dan, even after what Sadat did, which was huge back in 1977, even after that, even after the Jordanian Israel peace in 1994, even after the Oslo 1995, even after those things, the Arabs were still reluctant, and nobody actually showed them the vision of partnership, startups, technology, entrepreneurship. Nobody showed them that vision. Who did? Who did? I give full credit to President Bill Clinton for attempting to solve the problem. He did, honestly, he did, sincerely. He did that. But his lens probably was purely diplomatic and political. What Trump did, and that's new, is that to show the Arabs that you can actually have partnerships. You can have technology, you can have AI, you can jointly do it with Israelis. And Israelis don't want to establish a greater Israel and annihilate your territories, as the stories of the Islamists and the far left have been brainwashing you for decades. It's not true. Okay, there might be a few crazy Israelis who say that, but come on, hey, there are a few Arabs and Muslims also who dream about the caliphate, who dream about taking back Spain, and God knows what else. And who want to turn London into Londonistan. So, hey,
They're succeeding on that front.
and they're succeeding on that front, by the way, but that's a topic for another time. Okay. And so Trump, the only thing new, if you want to really simplify it and close this aspect of the conversation, what Trump did is to show the Arabs and Muslims, not just the nearby Arabs, but also as far as Indonesia, to show them, hey, you can have partnerships. Look at Azerbaijan. It had a problem, a territorial dispute. It worked with Israel and also with Turkey and Pakistan, by the way. And surprisingly, all these three countries were together on the ground, militarily helping Azerbaijan. I mean, not as forces, but maybe advisors and whatnot, and maybe equipment. So the point is, Azerbaijanis, the Indonesians, the Emiratis, even Pakistanis, by the way, although we don't have right now direct communication, everybody saw, hey, wait a second, we can still work with Israel, as Trump says, and he's a businessman and he knows what he's talking about, and while trying to solve, of course, the problem with the Palestinians. So that's the achievement of Trump.
I would say there's a bigger achievement here. And this is
Mm.
something that's always bewildered me these last 2 years, because the first year of this war was under the Biden administration, and I push back on people who say Biden was not pro-Israel. Biden was absolutely pro-Israel. Biden is an old school centrist Democrat Zionist. By the way, the new generation of Democrats, I'm not sure they are pro-Israel. In fact, I've talked to White House insiders who served under Biden and who would have been part of the Harris administration if she had won, and they tell me the next generation of Democrats are quite anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. Um, but but something that I've never understood about most American presidents, and that Trump seems to get very instinctively. Say what you will about anything else about him. America is the world's superpower. America is the most dominant economy and the most dominant military in the world, and it needs to act like it. And so you see, for example, until Ukraine, really, the Russians were tremendous at actually not being that strong of an economy or a military, but they would throw their weight around strategically and use, carrot and stick approach. The Chinese are excellent at investing and using soft power. et cetera. Even Iran knows how to. We saw how much of a paper tiger Iran was after Israel embarrassed it back in June. Um, but but why has America never been willing to realize it is a superpower, and America absolutely has the capability to pull, certainly Hamas's two sponsors, Qatar and Turkey, into a room, to pull the Egyptians into a room, to pull the Saudis in, to pull everybody into the room and say, guys, these are all the different points of leverage we have on all of you. This is everything you can get from us. This is every way we can pressure you. Get this war to stop now, because the only thing that kept Hamas going is that it had lifelines. And Hamas, to its credit, the one thing it did extraordinarily well, you mentioned this earlier, is it manipulated the media in order to bring out crowds and pressure on Biden, when it was a Democratic government, and on the various kind of more liberal governments of Europe and Canada and Australia, and it was able to utilize public opinion extraordinarily well. But along comes Trump, and this is, by the way, people don't realize this. With the Abraham Accords in the first place, I mean, he took countries that were on the verge of having relations with Israel anyway. He took countries that had back-channel relations to Israel anyway. But he basically said, look, the U.S. will sweeten the deal. The U.S. will give you F-35. The U.S. will give you a much stronger defense relationship. The U.S. will recognize, the Sahara. And then these countries are able to go to their publics and say, this is worth it for us. And this time around, what finally came about that I saw is the White House and Washington came to Qatar after, interestingly enough, Israel launched that strike on the Hamas leaders and said, "You want a defense pact? Okay, we want something from you." They went to the Turks and said, "Okay, you want F-35s? We want something from you," and he forced them to throw Hamas under a bus and make them choose between their inclinations and their strategic interests. And the Erdogan, say what you will about Erdogan and say what you will about the Al Thani family. I don't think they're good people. I don't think they're pro-West. I think they are Islamist, but they're not stupid. And they chose their strategic interests over their Islamist inclinations at the end of the day.
That's you just wow. You just made me sit where Erdogan and Qatar are and see how they really decided to make that shift. Now the question is, Dan, and I know you've worked, with people in government and you have experience with people in government and in military and in diplomacy and in the media. Tell me the kind of shift. Well, the US is a superpower, but it was a superpower under Biden. It was a superpower under Bill Clinton. It was a superpower under Obama. But why is it that the superpower under Trump managed to convince Indonesian president to commit 20,000 troops in Gaza, the Pakistani prime minister to come and stand in Sharm el Sheikh and agree to also be part of whatever solution is in Gaza, and to make and convince Erdogan, and it's difficult to convince President Erdogan, but convince him, and also convince the Qatar's leadership. So it is a superpower under Obama. It is a superpower under Biden and Clinton, but it is the same superpower under Trump that Trump manages to do it. How do you explain it?
I think for the first time, you have a president who really understands what it means to throw weight around. And if you are the world's preeminent economic and military power, throw that weight around. Get what you want. I don't understand why Biden was hesitant to do it. I have my theories on why Obama wouldn't do it, because I think President Obama was emblematic of a shift in American foreign policy thinking that does not believe in American exceptionalism and in American leadership. Obama's first, I remember I was a young advisor in the military. I was an advisor on foreign affairs, and I remember Obama's Cairo speech in his first term, and it was basically a litany of mea culpas and most of them were just preposterous.
Wow,
And
you just took us back to to the speech that really changed everything for America in the Middle East.
And it was a horrible speech, and
It was a horrible speech.
and it was and I appreciated always President Obama for his personality, for his oratory skills, for certainly seemed to be a man of values. But you're talking about a new generation. You see this now, by the way, in America, of Americans who don't believe in America. And I'm not saying President Obama didn't. I think the foreign policy minds that were involved in that administration um, don't believe in American greatness, American leadership, American exceptionalism, and therefore you can't throw American weight around or the vision of America that they have on the global scene. I mean, Obama's was very clear. I remember the Obama doctrine that came out was one of leading a first among equals type approach. And now
Was
what's
that a
interesting
speech taken? Yeah, how was that speech taken in Israel, by the way, Dan?
as in the
That speech.
abandonment of everything America should have stood for in the Middle East. And keep in mind, it came on the heels of it came a weird cozying up to Iran
Yeah.
and a harsh distancing from both Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and Israel. And so, us Middle East watchers here,
So also from Pakistan, where I'm right now. And let me tell you this, by the way, after that speech, you just mentioned that Israel felt a sense of abandonment or an impending abandonment. And let me just tell you the sense in Ankara, Cairo, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, even Kuwait City and Islamabad, there was people were like consulting each other. Like, what did you take away from that speech? Did we hear that correctly? Because what we heard, what these capitals heard, and I'm not speaking on their behalf, obviously, but as a journalist, I was in touch with journalists who are in contact with the national security establishment in these countries, and what they heard was America basically saying we're ditching our friends and allies and every idea that underpinned our alliances. And you know what? We might like the Khomeinists after all, you know? We might work with them in, yeah, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and maybe ally with them, and that's exactly what happened.
yeah,
Well,
100%. I 100% I agree with you, and that was very troubling. You had actually a conversation here in Israel after those years saying maybe Israel needs to start cultivating other relationships. Maybe Israel needs to start thinking about the day when America will not be pro-Israel. And I think, by the way, because you mentioned the Gulf states were thinking the same thing because they also felt abandoned. That was a big part of the impetus that led to the Abraham Accords, because the Abraham Accords is a lot of things. It's also partly, I think, a coalition, a strategic coalition of America's current friends who need to be working better together because America might not stay in their corner.
it's a great idea. That's a great idea. That brings us to the region now, Dan. Let's come to the region right now and what we're about to see going forward. So you just threw in a powerful idea. You said an impetus, one of the key impetuses for Israel, certainly, to get into Abraham Accords is because to have these relationships in the region sort of cushions Israel against, abandonment, by other powers that are outside this region. Of course, I don't consider the U.S. outside the region because the U.S. is actually part of the security political, system, that underpins the stability in this region. So that's a powerful idea now. Now, coming to what we can expect moving forward. Let's come now to a very radical idea, first of all.
So in Europe,
Bibi Netanyahu.
in your
No,
opinion,
no, I want to ask you a question. You want to ask me a question first? No, you want to ask me a question? Go ahead.
yeah, well, in your opinion, from an Arab perspective,
Hmm.
how first of all, how are the Arab countries viewing the Trump plan, and why did this work now, from your perspective?
Okay, now, one key undercurrent, something that is happening behind the walls and the doors that nobody sees, Dan, and nobody will tell you, by the way. Even if you speak to Arab journalists and Pakistani journalists and maybe others, they will not tell you, is a question of the legitimacy of the rulers in front of their own public opinions. And they're all very strong rulers, whether they're in Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Pakistan or Turkey. But Palestinian label has a power, something about it. It has been worked into this magic, this magical card that probably can destabilize even the most established of governments and rulers. So governments and I would say rulers in this region who were absolutely not worried about shaking hands with Benjamin Netanyahu before October 7 did feel jittery all of a sudden because they saw the Palestinian card as having the power within it to maybe delegitimize them within their own circles. They could see it in the eyes of people within their courts, probably, within the presidential palaces, within people they meet and trust and see every day. And probably those people, those are very people who came to them and say, you know what, sir, I think you need to go it slow, on Israel. Because, it was all right up until October 7, but with the visuals from Gaza, the war, the narrative that is taking over, that this is all about Palestinian rights and suppressing them and whatnot, you're risking a lot. I tell you, Dan, I don't want to point out specific countries because I travel around the region, but and including where I am right now in Pakistan, but um, there was serious concern across the region with some of the leaders that they could be assassinated by people very close to them who would exploit the Palestinian card for their own domestic agendas and interests, maybe to seize power or whatnot, And, there are always power struggles everywhere, whether it's Islamabad where I'm sitting or Morocco or anywhere. So, so, so this is an aspect that nobody was discussing in the Israeli media and the Western media. Maybe to a certain extent, I saw a couple of reports in New York Times, but not to the extent that they understand what's really going on here in this region. So that's why you saw a lot of the Arab friends of Israel sort of appear aloof, or maybe at times, try to be closer to the pro-Palestinian narrative, and especially closer to the Hamas narrative that they're fighting bravely for Palestinian rights. But let's be very, very clear, Dan. Nobody was under the pretenses or believed for a second that this war in October 7 was for Palestinian rights. Everybody knew from the beginning what it is about. And they knew if Israel is defeated in this war against Hamas, then Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, every country that has faced off with militant terror organizations is next after Israel. Let's Yes, as a national security journalist who covered my country's, Pakistan's war against Al Qaeda, I had absolute clarity from day one, from October 9th, from October 8th, the very next day. I had absolute clarity that this is what Israel is facing right now with Hamas in Gaza, is exactly what we in Pakistan faced with Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, what Saudi Arabia faced with the Al Qaeda inside Saudi Arabia, and with Al Houthi in Yemen, and the militias in Iraq, and what Egypt faced with the Muslim Brotherhood inside, and with the Al Qaeda and ISIS elements in the Sinai, who were, by the way, allied and had links with Hamas. So it was the clarity. The clarity was essential. And I am very sorry to report to you, Dan, that there were people in maybe Cairo, maybe Riyadh, maybe Islamabad, maybe elsewhere who did not have this clarity. And there were a lot of discussions.
That
And I was,
That's a powerful, powerful statement. I've said something these entire 2 years. I said, for the sake of the Abraham Accords to survive, Israel had to win this war. What you're saying is that for the sake of preventing a precedent of Islamist terrorist militias overrunning a state, the Arab countries knew Israel had to win this war, which both would explain very clearly why not a single Arab ambassador was pulled back from Israel, why there was barely any protest. And again, there's a big difference in how the public views it and how the governments viewed this. The governments of the region, by and large, with the exception of the radical axis, were completely in Israel's side and just couldn't say so.
I love the way you put it. Let me just go a step further and say all the major moderate Arab and Muslim states, despite public condemnations, were supporting Israel's victory over Hamas. As a matter of fact, even the most critical of Arab and Muslim states were privately telling, if they were meeting or communicating with Israelis at third places in conferences and whatnot, or maybe at the UN or through the United States, we're telling Israel, please tell Israel, if you started this, please finish it.
Finish it.
Do not end this without, because if you end this, we have a problem with Hamas. But if you end this, if Israel ends this without taking care of Hamas, then we will have problem with both Hamas and Israel. Yeah, it's ironic. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
The irony of this is that at the same time, you have the Western European countries, the Canadians, the Australians, and to some extent the Democrats in America,
Wow.
condemning Israel
Yeah.
and trying to push a premature ceasefire that leaves Hamas in power in order to end certainly the suffering, but the fake genocide, the fake starvation of the Palestinians, the narrative that they created, and they fell to it, immediately. And that's the big irony, is that Western Europe, and Western Europe, Canada, Australia, completely bought this, while the Arab countries, who know very well who Hamas is, as you say, were quietly but adamantly telling Israel to finish this job.
So October 7th switched roles, Dan. Now you have more friends in the Arab Muslim region. Israel has more friends in the Arab Muslim region than it does. Of course, it has friends in Europe and the West, obviously. But on the popular level, in the public opinion, in people who matter, the decision makers, people who understand national security, Israel has more friends in the Arab and Muslim region who understand why Israel's fight against Hamas and the Iranian axis was actually our fight.
That's a wrap for part one of my fascinating conversation with veteran Middle East journalist, war correspondent, and expert Ahmed Quraishi, who was talking to us live from Islamabad. We broke down the end of the Israel-Hamas war, the diplomacy that led to the Egypt summit, and how Arab leaders quietly supported Israel's victory as a way to stop the spread of radical Islamic extremism throughout the region. If you're enjoying this series, make sure to subscribe to The Middle East Breakdown on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Make sure to give us a good rating, and please follow us across all social media for clips and updates.